If you want to excite Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Rick Bragg, just get him talking about the South.
I always thought it was hilarious that we called like our cities these names, like the Big Easy. There ain't nothing easy about New Orleans. If you slow down on a street corner in New Orleans, someone will run over you.
He has lived all over the country and worked all over the world. But the Deep South is Rick Bragg's home, and he is sharing some of his homespun wit and wisdom in a new collection of essays and articles all about his life in the deep American South.
I really haven't changed that much. I haven't improved at all, except that I have a slightly better pickup truck.
In Where I Come From, Bragg explores everything from road trips and fire ants to pig's feet and Tupperware. But hidden under the humor is a nagging truth-telling about a cultural tapestry that is frayed and fading.
Southerners are all full of this Gothic angst, but you can kind of hear the bridges falling down here. You can hear the bridges falling. You can hear the hands of some kind of ancient, rusty courthouse clock clang into place, striking midnight.
Rick Bragg, thanks very much for joining us today. I really enjoyed the book. It's a very fast read. I mean, most of the entries in it are 2 or 3 pages. A few of the essays are longer, but just an awful lot of fun. Stories from the Deep South is the subhead of the book. Where do you draw the line between the South and the Deep South, and what is the difference between the South and the Deep South?
Well, I'd love to go into some protracted geographical and physiological rambling about that. But the truth is, Deep South just sounds better. Just sounds better. A lot of people think that the Deep South would be like, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, of course. But really, the book was intended to be a good book for these times, a good escape for these times, and gentler and softer than just about anything I've ever put together. But that was kind of by design, I think.
As I mentioned, these are generally pretty short because they're essays that have been lifted from other things that you've written through the years. And one of the sources for this is Garden and Gun magazine. I didn't know there was a Garden and Gun magazine. I can imagine.
I can
imagine guns and ammo, but gardening and guns.
Yeah, it's actually one of the most celebrated new literary magazines out there. It's been judged the best of its kind, actually, in some of these contests. You can call it a regional magazine, except it probably sells as many copies in Manhattan as it sells in Mississippi. It's a literary magazine. It's a lifestyle magazine, but it's a literary magazine. And it's been around for a while, won a bunch of awards. It has some of the best writers in the country that write for it. And, down here, if you're going to write softer things, and I do love to write about fishing. I don't know how to write about gardening. I've never gardened a thing since I was probably 5 years old. But I love to write about fishing. I love to read about my part of the country by people who look at it with an eye toward the beauty of it, but also who don't ignore the warts of it.
You find it harder to write the shorter ones than the longer ones?
I can't even get to the point talking to you. I can't even get to the point having a conversation. So it's hard for me to get to the point in 500 words or so. Most of the things I've written in my life were long, and we knocking on our 10th book, and most of my magazine stories were longer. But yeah, it's hard. It's really hard because by the time you get to the point, you're through. And I found the only way to do it was to take a small idea, not and go out from there, rather than take a big idea and try to twist it into something that fit.
Yeah, wasn't there like an old Mark Twain quote or something about, I'm sorry I wrote you such a long letter, but I didn't have time to write you a short one?
Yeah, that's true. I've had some good editors over the years, and if it weren't for that, I'd probably still be working on my first story I ever started to write.
You had mentioned fishing, and you had talked about something I'd never heard of. There are a lot of things there I'd never heard of. We'll get to a lot of them, I suppose. But the Jubilee.
Yeah.
Tell folks what the Jubilee is all about.
It's a phenomenon that only occurs in two places on the planet: the eastern shore of Mobile Bay and Japan. And it is when a change in the oxygen level in the water forces the bottom dwellers in the bay, which is rays, crabs, eels, flounder, creatures like that, to literally flee the water. Crabs come up on shore and pile up against the seawall. Flounder pile up like dinner plates. It's not a man-made, although certainly pollution doesn't help things, but it's a natural phenomenon. And people come out like a celebration almost, and they load up flounder by the boatload. They take 5-gallon buckets full of crabs, and they have fish fries that last 4 days, and then all of a sudden the water chemistry changes, temperature changes, and everything goes back to normal.
Well, speaking of food, another thing that I learned in the book is that there's more than one version of a poor boy, or po' boy, I guess is probably the proper pronunciation. And how many variations on the poor boy are there?
Well, enough to starve me to death sitting here and not having had lunch yet. A lot of people think about shrimp. But my favorite is at a place called Domalice's in New Orleans, and it's half shrimp, half oyster. But then there's the roast beef po' boy, which is roast beef, gravy, sometimes mayonnaise on top of that. Someone explained it to me once that it's not a good po' boy unless if you hold it over your head, the gravy runs down your arm. There's the infamous French fry po' boy, which is just French fries crammed into a po' boy bun. There's, ham and cheese pork chop.
Pork chop.
Which is just fun to say. Just pork chop po' boy.
You have Grappico soda down there? That's another one?
Yeah. And it's when I was a kid,
grape soda of some sort?
It's great. It's just grape soda, but it mostly it's artificial coloring, sugar, and water. But I tell you, in August, 107 degrees, a Grappico soda with a big chunk of ice is a reason to live.
We've been talking about food a lot. I mean, it seems like, and I suppose a lot of cultures would argue this, but it seems to me that so much of Southern culture is about the food.
I have probably spent more time describing food than I have the landscape, describing food than I have my own people. One, I like to eat. Two, my mama was the best cook in the world, and I wrote a book that said so. But the excesses of the food, and I'm not talking about the quantities, but the seasoning is just, it is a little different from most places. And I asked someone once at a book event, I said, have you ever had a rice cake? You know, those things you buy in the grocery store that are, and they said, yeah. And I said, did you really like it? And they said, well, it kept me alive. And I said, have you ever had hot sausage gravy on a biscuit, on a hot biscuit? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, that's what good writing ought to be like. Good writing ought to be like sausage gravy on a hot biscuit.
I know that although you live in rural Alabama now, that's home, that you've lived in Los Angeles, you've lived in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I also know you were a friend of Pat Conroy's, who wrote, among other great books, The Prince of Tides.
Mm-hmm.
When you were in those big cities, did you find yourself a little bit like the protagonist in The Prince of Tides, in that because you just, by virtue of having a Southern accent, that these people in these bigger cities kind of, looked down on you or thought, oh, this guy's got to be a rube?
I think that has to happen, and you can respond to it two ways. You can jut your jaw out and be pricklish about it, or I found that not giving a damn was a really good way to go about it. Actually, New Yorkers were very kind to me. The doorman in my building told me everything twice. Like, when I would ask him for directions, he would say, and I can't do a New York accent, so I won't try, but he'd say, now you go out here to the corner. Now that's this corner right here. And you go left. Now that's this way. And then you take a right at 42nd. That's 4-2. And I actually kind of appreciated them. A Southern accent can be disarming. My hillbilly accent from the foothills of the Appalachians, they probably hadn't heard it since a sitcom from the 1950s. I had a talk once where I gave what I thought was an impassioned talk on literature. And I looked out in the crowd, and everybody seemed to be with me. It's almost an evangelical thing when readers get to thinking about reading and why they love it, and it was just such a good reading, such a good event. And when I was done, a young woman raised her hand, and I thought, well, this is great. They're full of the spirit of reading and writing. And I said, yes, ma'am, do you have a question? And she said, yes. Is it true that Southerners eat dirt? And I should have said, no, it is not true. We do not eat dirt. But I just couldn't resist. And I said, well, it depends on what kind of dirt. Field dirt, of questionable origin, with livestock running around on it. We would not eat. But a good nutty clay from deep in the ground, we find that to be preferable.
You've worked at various times as a reporter, covering difficult stories sometimes. I'm wondering, on the topic of the Southern accent, if you think that sort of Southern disarming countenance has actually helped you a few times. You just automatically sort of seem like a friend.
I think it has definitely helped. People are always a little bit surprised and probably amused. I don't know if it helped me very much in Haiti, or if it helped me very much in Pakistan after 9/11. But it is a novelty, I think. And it is a novelty. Being a writer and being Southern isn't exactly a big surprise.
There have been some really great ones. And I'm wondering if there's something that sort of binds them all together. I mean, Tennessee Williams, of course, we lay some claim to him up here in St. Louis. But Truman Capote, Margaret Mitchell, Pat Conroy, Harper Lee, Rick Bragg. Is there anything that you see as a common thread with all of these Southern writers?
That's a $40 question right there. And English professors can get together and talk about this for about, a year and a half, and they get together at seminars and talk about this ad nauseum, mostly in obscurity, but they'll talk about it forever. Some people say it's the pathos. They say that it's the fact that so much has been lost here, even in winning. A lot of Southerners like me, we don't want to return to the bad old days. We don't want to turn back time. We don't want to go back to the racisms and the meanness and the classisms of the old South. But there has been a lot lost. And I think that you can talk about the heat, you can talk about some other notions, but I believe it was a war fought for rich men. My people were cannon fodder in the Civil War. Some didn't fight at all, because we're from that region of the South, the Highland South, where there were actually quite a few loyalists to the Union. But I have relatives who fought in the Army in North Georgia. But they didn't ride around on beautiful stallions swinging a saber. They died of dysentery. They didn't own slaves, but they fought for a doomed ideal in a rich man's war. And the only way to explain it is that sometimes it's the fight that appeals to people down here, not the cause. It's the fight. And I can't really explain it much better than that. But I think that there's a grit and a just kind of a blazing color to the place down here that lends itself to good writing. Just take Thomas Wolfe, open the book, close your eyes, and stab a paragraph, and it'll be prettier than just about anybody else's paragraph. Eudora Welty, the first paragraph of Where Is the Voice Coming From? Tennessee Williams wrote a short story called One Arm that is as bleak an exploration of human frailty as has ever been done. And Larry McMurtry can write about the Texas Hill Country and with a bleak and violent nature that just somehow makes you glad to be alive. So, Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain, one of the saddest books I've ever read, but just is absolutely real sounding. Charles Frazier wrote a book of poetry about cotton mills that is so true it'll make you cry, about men and women throwing themselves against these machines just to try to survive. So I think the poverty and the grit and the violence, there's plenty of violence up north. There's plenty of grit up north. But there is something about it all churning down here. I always thought it was hilarious that we called our cities these names, like the Big Easy. There ain't nothing easy about New Orleans. If you slow down on a street corner in New Orleans, someone will run over you. There is nothing easy about New Orleans. I'm not doing a good job answering, but maybe that's the point, is that there's not a real answer to it. It's just, I don't have any interest writing about the rich folks. I am uninterested in the antebellum South. I'm uninterested in cotillions. A cotillion would bore the mortal hell out of me. But I love to write about pulpwooders and oyster fishermen and steel workers and women who stand with a baby on their hip while they walk 4 miles to go get their sorry husband out of jail. I love writing about them people.
Well, you do say in the book a couple of times, as I recall, that how much you love the South, but that sometimes it can really break your heart.
Constantly, my mother is 83 and she has survived more than I can even say. And, they prop up women like her, prop up sorry men, fight to give their children a chance, drag cotton sacks. Every time I pass a cotton field, my mother will have me slow down because she thinks they're beautiful. And I look at her and I'll say, but didn't you almost kill yourself in one of those? And it doesn't matter. It's still beautiful to her. I'm
so glad to hear that she's still with you, because I wasn't sure how old some of those essays were. And she's one of the great characters of the book.
Yeah. My whole ambition here toward the end, I hope this isn't the end of my life, but one of my great ambitions was to have people see the value in my mama. And I think we pulled that off. I ought to take a day off. But I keep hammering at it, I guess. When all this happened, long before it happened, my mom had been ill, so I came home and find myself doing the same things that I did 50 years ago. I'm still lugging around sacks of hog feed. I'm still lugging around horse feed and bags of cement. A bag of cement that should weigh 30 pounds weighs 80. And I'm thinking to myself, and I'm throwing it into the bed of a pickup. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute. I've had like a handful of bestsellers. Shouldn't I not be lugging around sacks of hog feed?
I was going to say you got a Pulitzer Prize for.
Yeah, but it doesn't. Yeah, that won't get you much here on the Roy Webb Road or the Mark Green Road won't get you much in Calhoun County. I find myself doing the same damn things that I did 50 years ago.
It must be because you like it.
Well, it's because how do you say to your people, yeah, I won a Pulitzer. I don't think I'll help unload the truck. How do you say that to your family? You can't say that. They'd run me out or beat me to death.
You mentioned in the book more than a few times, and not surprisingly, sort of this pickup truck culture down there.
Yeah, sure.
But you also mentioned a couple of times that I guess it's not a real Southern pickup truck unless it has a can of brake fluid in it.
Yeah, this is the way to tell a real truck. In the bed of the truck will be a empty can. I don't know why they didn't throw it away. Will be an empty can of brake fluid and about 4 feet of rusted logging chain curling up, getting more rusted. Why there has to be both instead of one or the other, but you have to have both or it's not a real truck. And sometimes a broken handled shovel that you fully intend to fix someday.
I sort of get the sense from the book, although there's a lot of joyous passages in it and fun stories like we've been sharing, that there's a sense that you're mourning something a little bit about the South. What is that, if I've even nailed it correctly here?
Well, that's a very good observation, quite frankly. Southerners are all full of this Gothic angst, but you can kind of hear the bridges falling down here. You can hear the bridges falling. You can hear the hands of some kind of ancient, rusty courthouse clock clang into place, striking midnight. We'll always have stories to tell about that time, but increasingly you have to just make them up. They're in novels more than they are in memory.
Sorry to hear that you feel that so much of the Southern culture is disappearing, but thankful at least that you've taken the time to record it and document it all these years and put it into great books like Where I Come From, Stories from the Deep South. It's a wonderful read, and it's been really wonderful talking to you, Rick. Thanks very much.
I appreciate it. Appreciate the questions. I try not to be one of those Southerners who waste whole days lamenting things that now lie discarded beside a road we'll never travel again. I try. But I miss stadium hot dogs and wax paper. I miss real country music with steel guitar and soul. I miss old growth forests in the shade of the Stone Mountains. I miss the white dunes of the Gulf, buried now under miles of concrete. I miss tea cakes, the kind my grandmother made. I miss the amazing rhythm AC. I miss old barns telling me to see Rock City. And I miss Tupperware.